All right. So kind of try to jump into this pretty quick. Um, so the only thing that we should be thinking about today in terms of what still is due in this class is that fifth Canvas discussion. So I've started to kind of grade those if you've submitted it. So you should see that grade start popping up. I'll try to get them graded as quickly as possible. They're due at the end of the day today. And then the same thing, the quiz six is due by the end of the day today as well. That daily quiz, I'll get that posted after class. It was due before we started class. And then that extra credit, making sure honor lock is working correctly, is kind of set right here. So one thing I'm pretty sure this is, it should walk you through. When I put the honor lock on the final exam, it might prompt you for an access code. Honor lock should give that to you when you're signing in. So if you've already kind of downloaded that on your device, it should work pretty seamlessly. Um, if you have any issues with that, once again, that final, it's open from 9 to 4 tomorrow. Once you start, you've got 2 hours to complete it. We've kind of went through what materials are allowed. Um, Scratch blank paper, handwritten notes. You can have a physical calculator out or use the one that's built into the HonorLock system. You can't have any web browsers or programs open on your device. You have to have a working webcam. If you have any issues getting into that, I'll keep an eye on my email. Um, but other than that, that should kind of cover everything. This hypothetical grade tool, once all those assignments are in, you can kind of look at what your Canvas grade is in each one of those categories, plug them in, and then kind of play around with, if I get this on the final, this would be my grade, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. I will try to get grades finalized pretty quickly. So I'll be working on it over the weekend. I'm thinking that Monday, I'll get them posted. I'll put up an announcement once that's the case, kind of explaining how to, how the grade was calculated, although that's in the syllabus. And then that should kind of cover it in terms of this, ending out the class. Um, you can now, I've got some questions that I think might be worthwhile to kind of work through if we run out. But any practice problem questions, any old quiz questions, feel free to ask them. We can kind of start working through those. Unless there's any other questions, we'll just kind of dive into that. Okay. All right. So are there any problems that people want to see worked through as we start out here? So I know we had a couple yesterday, so I'll keep an eye on the chat if you kind of think of some um, along the way, or if as I'm working through something, if you have a question, feel free to kind of put it in the chat there. So one thing I thought might be valuable to review is all the way back in Module 9. And once we do this one, I'll probably jump to some Module 12 material since we didn't have as much time to cover that. And then I'll get to kind of this question on Quiz 5. Okay. So the first thing I would know how to be able to do is, let's say I give you a consumption function and it looks something like this. Okay. I then tell you the level of disposable income is this, right? And I then ask you what type of gap exists, right? And in order to close that gap, what would government spending have to be? So the way that we're going to identify the gap is it's that difference between what the actual consumption is and what the total kind of potential GDP is, or what that disposable income in the economy is. Okay. So here, the first thing we need to do is calculate consumption. So I have what, 100 plus 0.7 times 600. I think if I'm getting that entered into my calculator correctly here, we would actually have a gap of negative 80, right? If you're calculating kind of what this is, or sorry, that's not the gap yet. So consumption um should be what? So I've got, I think this should be 520. If I'm getting my math entered in here correctly. So I'll just double check myself here ahead of class, but I wanted to make sure I didn't, because I changed the numbers a little bit to kind of make a point. Yep. So here, what would the value of the gap be? Well, actual consumption is 520. The level of disposable income, 600. So that current consumption, we can think about that's like our short run GDP. the potential or long run GDP is higher than that. So what type of gap would we have? Well, if GDP is too low, we've got a recessionary gap. So before we start to work through the numbers, if we have a recessionary gap, what do we want to do? We want to increase GDP. We can do that by increasing government expenditures or decreasing taxes. Okay. So if we're asked here, what type of gap exists? We've got a recessionary gap. What would the change in consumption have to be, right, in order for us to close that gap? Or, sorry, not the change in consumption, the change in government spending to be to close that gap. Okay. Well, we kind of said that change in government spending should be the change that I need in GDP, which here we have -80, multiplied by 1 over 1 minus that marginal propensity to consume. So remember that marginal propensity to consume is that kind of decimal or that fraction that's in our consumption function. So here that would be 0.7. Okay. If we get this entered into our calculator, and before we do this, one way we can make sure we don't make a mistake is that change, initial change in our, or sorry, I wrote this backwards. I said, what do we want? I'm asking you for the change in government spending. I skipped a step, sorry. So that's 0.7. This is what we don't know, and we know we want to close that gap of -80. So if I rearrange this a little bit, I've got that change in government spending should be that change in GDP divided by 1 over 1 minus that marginal propensity to consume, or -80, right? That was kind of what our gap was. We actually want to increase government spending, right? So we want to increase it by 80. And then here, 1 over 1 minus 0.7. Okay. So if I get this entered into my calculator, one way I can check this is whatever the change in GDP is, the change in government spending is less, right? So this is the idea that, if we take this fraction, it's always going to be greater than 1. And so that change in government spending that we need to get our change in GDP will always be less than that. If we go through kind of this calculation, I believe we get 24. So if the government wants to close that recessionary gap, they need to increase spending by $24. Okay. Any questions on that before I add in like a second question I could ask here? Okay. So another question could be, what is the change needed in taxes, right? So the change needed in taxes, we've got kind of that same setup, but we said that tax multiplier was negative marginal propensity to consume over 1 minus that, right? So we plug in our 0.7. We know that the change in GDP we want is -80. So if we rearrange this equation a little bit, that change we need in taxes is -80 divided by 0.7 over 1 minus 0.7. Okay. Now, before we even make this calculation, we said that because this isn't a 1, and it's always going to be something less than 1, that multiplier is going to be lower for taxes. So what's always going to be true is to close that same gap, the change that we need in taxes is actually going to be greater than that change we need in government spending. Sure enough, if we calculate this, right, and I forgot my negative sign here, we'd end up with what a change in taxes would be, I think, approximately 34.29. Okay. Now here's where we have to be careful. If we want to increase GDP, right, that it was 800 too low, so we actually want to increase, right? And here, if I'm thinking about negative, this was the gap we're trying to close, so we wanted to increase GDP, which means we were trying to add 80, right? That change in taxes, sure enough, is greater than the change that we need in government spending. So I might ask you about a directional change, which is to close that same gap, what would have to be true about the changes in taxes? It's always greater than that change in government spending. And here's where we have to be careful. If we want to increase GDP, what do we actually need to do? Well, we actually need to lower taxes, right? So the change in taxes we need is 34.29, but we need to lower them, right? So you'll kind of be instructed in the problem. If you need to lower taxes or government spending, put a negative sign there. Okay. Any questions on that one before I move to the next question that we had in the chat? Okay. So quiz 5. So what is the change in G not negative? So remember, how do we close a recessionary gap? If this kind of helps you kind of keeps this straight. When we had a recessionary gap, what we were saying is we had our aggregate demand, we had our long run aggregate supply. This would be the level of long run GDP, right? If we had a recessionary gap, which we identified earlier, that means that wherever that current short run aggregate supply is, it's hitting my aggregate demand at a GDP level that is too low. So if we want to decrease that recessionary gap, right? So here we've got GDP being too low. We've got a recessionary or deflationary gap. Once again, this will be the terminology I use on the exam, either inflation or recessionary. So if we wanted to increase aggregate demand, how do we do that? Well, C plus I plus G plus net exports. We can either increase government spending, or if we decrease taxes, what does that do? It increases consumption, right? So that's where, the change in taxes is always the opposite of that change in government spending in terms of the sign or the direction. Okay. And then number 8 on quiz 5. So we've got things pulled up here. So I'm looking at quiz 5, question 8. So we're starting out and we have government decreasing taxes. And as a result, they close that gap. Okay. So we're thinking about here, we're starting out now where we've got no gap in GDP after that government spending. So we have kind of our long run, short run aggregate supply, right? The government decreased taxes. Sorry, not government spending, but we had an initial change, which was lowering taxes. Okay. However, as a result, so this is where I'm kind of directing you towards that secondary effect. So here's where we said we start out with no gap. However, the secondary effect, so that initial tax change worked, but we've got a secondary effect, which is if we lower taxes, right, we said what's going to happen? Well, if people don't have to pay as high of taxes, they're not going to have to save as much. So that supply in terms of um, our loanable funds, right? They don't need they're going to be supplying kind of less to that loanable funds market. So we could think about here if we had our supply and demand for loanable funds. So we've got the quantity of loanable funds here. And we could think about here we've got kind of real interest rates. So here was our initial interest rate, right? If we get a supply decrease, people don't need to save as much, right? Um, make sure I'm matching this up with the problem. So however, oh, sorry, this one's not talking about the crowding out effect. Sorry. That's a different problem. This question asks about what's the response in long run aggregate supply. So if we have lower taxes, what's that going to do? People have more available funds. They invest into things like education, or with lower taxes, if I work, I'm essentially taking home more money. So we would also see that kind of increases our labor supply, which is specifically what this question is asking about. So if we have an increase in labor supply, what does that do? It increases our short run GDP. So that first part is that we're going to see an increase in aggregate, long run aggregate supply because of that decrease in taxes. What's that going to do to my long run prices? Well, my long run prices are where aggregate demand hits long run aggregate supply. So what has happened to my price level? Kind of shorthanding this here. We've got a decrease in my short run prices, right? Or sorry, short and long run prices here. I've got kind of that change in long run prices. So in order for that inflationary gap to exist, right? So that labor supply causes short run GDP to go up, right? If we were to kind of add in the second part, which is that we had simultaneous shifts, right? Well, that impact of long run aggregate supply, that was causing our short run, or sorry, I put short run here. Sorry, I'm writing tongue quick. So my long run GDP goes up, but what does government spending do? Well, if I decrease taxes, right, that caused kind of short run GDP to go up, right? So what would have to be true if we have an inflationary gap, right? Then we don't need the GDP to be lower. We actually need it to be greater, right? So we would have to see that that change in aggregate demand was actually something that is higher in order to push GDP in the short run. So here, long run aggregate supply increase the long run GDP, decreases in taxes increase that short run. Well, if they're exactly the same, we would still have no gap. However, if we have an inflationary gap, we need that change from taxes to actually push short run GDP, right? If we want an inflationary gap, we need that short run GDP to actually be too high. So that change from taxes would have to be greater than that change that existed from long run aggregate supply. So this is definitely going to be one of the more difficult questions you would see pop up on the exam. It's going to look at that secondary effect of taxes, right? Increasing labor supply, you were directed towards that. But then comparing these simultaneous shifts in both something that changes aggregate demand and changes long run aggregate supply, in order to get a certain type of gap, you would need the one that here, inflationary gap, the one that's pushing short run GDP up, has to push it up more than the one that's increasing long run GDP. Okay. Any questions on that one before we keep moving? So to see price increases, we always compare to the original graph before the shift. Um, yeah, so there I was specifically asking you about the changes in prices caused just by that long run aggregate supply increase. If I had instead asked you about prices, um, there it would matter the relative size of the shift, right? Kind of similar to here, really what I would focus on with simultaneous shifts is what that change in GDP is and whether inflation or deflationary gap would exist. So that's kind of like two parts of the question. One, what's just the impact of long run aggregate supply going up on prices? And then the second part is when we have these simultaneous shifts, what's going to cause an inflation or deflationary gap or recessionary gap? Does that make sense or clarify that? Yeah, so if I did ask you about prices, one of them is increasing prices, one of them is decreasing, that simultaneous shift, yeah, we wouldn't know what happens to prices unless I know which one of those is larger. Yep. And then what was the second question in the chat? Can we do number 10? So let's see. So number 10 is asking about the money multiplier and new loans from the Fed. Am I on the right quiz here? Yes. So if we're looking at number 10, I think I can't remember what section if we reviewed this yesterday, but if I'm thinking about what is that change in my money supply, it's going to be equal to the change or kind of what my initial deposits are from a non-government entity, right? Multiplied by 1 over that required reserve ratio. Now we have to be careful here. So the initial point here is not the initial deposit. It's going to be the additional amount or the initial amount that we have to loan out. Okay. So when I have a deposit here of like, I think the number I'm looking at is 1,919. Right? If that's the initial deposit from a non-government entity, what do we have left to loan out? Well, the amount that we have left to loan out is whatever that deposit was. However, we have to hold, and here we're told that required reserve ratio is 15%. So we have to set part of this aside. How much do we have to set aside? Whatever that initial deposit was, times the decimal form of our required reserve ratio. Right? So I don't have this number off the top of my head. So let's see here. 1919 minus 1919 times 0.15. And this is where you want to be careful when we're seeing how much we have to set aside. We're using the decimal form of that required reserve ratio. If you didn't do that, just to kind of help identify really kind of easy mistakes, you'll get like an absurd, I think, negative 200 and negative 26,000. So, we're going to come up with a pretty absurdly large value there. So that's one way to kind of check yourself. And also it would be negative, which doesn't make sense if we're trying to kind of increase that money supply. So from here we had, this ends up being what? 1631.25. So that's the amount that we initially have to loan out. Okay. So to find that change in the money supply, we would take that initial amount we have to loan out, 1 over, once again, that required reserve ratio, but in decimal form. So if we do that, I think we get here, what would that resulting change in the money supply be? 10874. And here in a problem like this, I would tell you to round to the nearest integer. Okay. Now, in addition to this, one thing I would think about is what if instead the Fed, how would they increase the money supply? They would buy securities or bonds. If they bought securities and bonds for the same exact amount as the initial non-government entity deposit, it is not subject to the initial, setting aside or the required reserve ratio. So there, if we're thinking about the change in the money supply coming from the Fed, if the Fed deposits money or buys securities, it's that full amount that they bought from securities times 1 over that required reserve ratio. Well, notice if the Fed deposits the money, they don't have to set any aside. That's always going to be higher. That same kind of purchase by the Fed is going to have a larger change in the money supply than if it was a non-government deposit, right? So they're kind of knowing that concept that the change in the money supply, if I'm writing this out, from the Fed buying securities will always be larger than the change in the money supply from deposits from non-government entities. Okay. I think that should answer the questions. Yeah, that was just looking for the value amount. Okay. Any other questions people kind of want to see worked through before I start kind of adding some stuff in here? Similar to the midterm, if we get some blanks correct, I don't know. Yeah, so the only ones that are partial credit are these fill in the blanks. So if you have a select all that apply, multiple choice, or numerical example, or numerical problem, all those are kind of all or nothing. And then partial credit is given to those fill in the blank problems. Okay, so question 12 from quiz 6. So this is where I can't go through the exact one, but I'll walk through something that's kind of similar. So this one's talking about exchange rates, foreign currency, US GDP will change, and then a simultaneous shift. Okay, so let's say in this one, let's say instead I have the price of a foreign currency goes down. Okay, so if the price of a foreign currency goes down, and we're thinking about, we're looking at the quantity of the US dollar, we're looking at the international market and the exchange rate for the US dollar. Right? So we're going to have some supply and demand for the US dollar. Our initial equilibrium exchange rate starts out here. Okay. Let me make sure that is the question that was asked about, right? Question 12. Yep. So if that's the case, right, anytime we see changes in the foreign market, so this is maybe something I would keep in mind. Changes in the domestic market, or here we were kind of always keeping that as the US, these are going to impact demand. Changes in foreign markets or for other countries, that's always going to impact the supply of the US dollar. So we said, what are the things that would increase demand for the domestic product? Well, if prices are lower in the US, more people want to hold the US dollar. Kind of increases in productivity essentially lowered prices. So these would have kind of the same effect. These are both going to increase demand for the US dollar. The other things we talked about, what if we have increases in the US interest rate? Well, they're putting money into that US dollar. If I'm investing, the interest rate is a good thing. So when the interest rate in the US is higher, other countries are more likely to want to hold that dollar, or we would see a demand increase. And then kind of the last one was if we have more economic stability, that would also cause our demand to go up. Now, everything in the foreign market kind of works in the opposite direction, right? So if instead the US wants to supply more of the US dollar to foreign markets, well, they're going to want to do that when prices in those foreign markets are lower, right? Or if productivity in those foreign markets goes up, that lowers the prices. Or if interest rates are higher in other economies, we want to take the US dollar and invest in that foreign currency. Or if we have increases in economic stability in those other countries, we would kind of see all of these would cause shifts in or increases in supply. And then everything would work in kind of the opposite direction. So here, if I see that the price in the foreign currency is lower, right, then what are we going to want to do? We're going to want to take that US dollar. It now has more value in the foreign market. We're going to supply more of the US dollar. What does that do to exchange rates? It should decrease them. Okay. Any questions there before we keep moving? So that's kind of the first part. Make sure I keep an eye on this chat. Okay. And then if we're looking at the second part of that question, so we had the change in the exchange rate there. The second part of the question is now thinking about what's going to happen to US real GDP. So we've got a change in the exchange rate. We're now going to connect this to, so we just said the exchange rate goes down. What's that going to do in the overall US economy? So we start out, and this would be one where we're starting out assuming that we have no gap, right? And we're thinking about just what's the impact of that exchange rate going down. So here is our initial prices. Here is our initial long run and short run GDP. Or I said the phrase I would use on the exam is current GDP is the same as potential, right? Potential is another word for the long run. Current is short run. Okay. So if we have the US dollar, the exchange rate is going down, we said, what impacts is that going to have? Well, essentially, this is depreciation. So I might ask you to kind of use these terms on questions on the exam. If we have the value of the dollar is going down, we call that depreciation. So value of the US dollar is decreasing. That means our money can buy less in foreign markets, or we're going to see that imports go down. Now, I said you can work through the opposite. If you know that the US dollar is decreasing in value, the foreign currency is increasing in value, which means they can buy more US products. Whichever way is easier for you to think about, these will always work in the same direction in terms of how they impact net exports. So here, what's going to happen to my net exports? Well, if that's exports minus imports, if this goes, where is it? If this goes down and exports goes up, net exports would increase. Remember, what is aggregate demand? C plus I plus G plus net exports. So here, if I asked you what happens to imports, you could tell me. What happens to net exports, you could tell me here. That's going to shift my aggregate demand to the right, right? So the impact on the US is real GDP, and I would be specific, a little more specific here. If we're talking about this, we're thinking about changes in the GDP. Aggregate demand, we said never changes long run GDP, right? Here, kind of my long run GDP would be exactly the same. Where does aggregate demand hit my long run aggregate supply? The only GDP that aggregate demand changes are going to cause are shifts in my, or changes in my, I shouldn't say shifts, changes in my short run GDP. Okay. So here, if I have increases in my short run GDP, a follow-up or additional question could be, what type of gap was created? An inflationary gap. Okay. So this is probably, a pretty difficult question. I might be a little bit kinder on the final, where maybe I ask you about what the impact of exchange rates were on US GDP, kind of creating inflationary deflationary gaps. Another one could be I give you a change that you then identify, not from the foreign market, but just is there an inflation or deflationary gap, which leads us to kind of that second part of the question. So here, so it'd be specific. Yeah, if I asked you this question, I would be specific about if it's long run or short run GDP. To be honest, I'm always going to focus on short run GDP here because what did we say? Changes in aggregate demand never change that long run GDP. Okay. The only thing that changes long run GDP would be changes in long run aggregate supply. Okay. Um, so the final part of that question is if the government then engages in expansionary fiscal policy, or sorry, here I'm going to do the opposite. So let's say we've got an inflationary gap. What does the government want to actually do? They want to push us back to those long run outcomes. If we want to decrease GDP, that's going to be called contractionary fiscal policy. So this is the idea that if I ever want to decrease GDP, we're looking at contractionary policies. Now, here specifically, we're thinking about the government so they could spend or change taxes, right? So if they wanted to do this, right, they want to decrease aggregate demand. This isn't part of the question, but how can they do that? They can decrease government spending, or we said they could increase taxes. Now, if they do that and we have simultaneous changes, what's going to happen to the price level? Right? Well, from that initial change, prices went up, right? So those exchange rate changes caused prices to increase, right? What's the only way, or sorry, here then I'm asking you what happens to the price level after we adjust to that and have contractionary fiscal policy? Well, the size matters, right? Because if I were to draw this out on a separate graph, what does decreases in aggregate demand do? Well, it's going to be pushing price levels lower, right? So there, if I'm pushing price levels to be lower, the answer would be it depends, because if that change in government spending is relatively small, notice um, relative to the old price, my prices are still higher, right? However, if that government spending is very, very large, that change in the price level, I'm drawing this pretty extreme here, could be lower than they were at the initial levels. So when we have these simultaneous changes in both, they're both influencing aggregate demand, we don't know what's going to happen to prices. I would need to know which of these effects is larger, right? So that change in either government spending or that increase in taxes is going to push my price level lower. So the answer here is indeterminate. If I had like a separate question, I wouldn't kind of add this in. This would be like a separate, like standalone question. But if we ever have things that are shifting aggregate demand simultaneously, what's the only way that I would get, say, prices to decrease? It would have to be that change in government spending was larger than that change we saw in the international markets for the exchange rate. So once again, this would be like one of the more difficult questions on the exam. I added some things in here where I wouldn't ask you all of these in the same question, but this is kind of a very complete model of the types of questions you could see. Any questions on that one before we keep moving here? Okay. Any other questions you guys have? I have another one from Module 12, I think would be very good to look at. And this was actually one I had written down as well, so that's good. Okay. So what if instead, so let's say we're thinking about a problem. Some of my stuff in this, right? I'll grab some extra paper here, just so when I start working through this, we won't kind of lead in. So this is another one I would be make sure I know how to do. Wink, wink. So let's say I gave you the um, demand function for foreign countries of the US product. So here, this is kind of the demand equation we had for that foreign country, right? We said, how do we determine how much of the US product they want to buy or how many US dollars would they want to hold? So here, I could ask simply, what is the price of 1 unit of this good in the foreign market? Well, I would have to tell you some additional things, which is the price in the foreign market is the price in the US times the exchange rate, right? So let's say I told you the price in the US is 60, the exchange rate is 2.5. Okay. Well, we can figure out, right, just plugging our values in, what the price level would have to be in that foreign currency. So if we do that, what, 60 times 0.25 should be 150, right? If I then simply asked you what's the quantity of the product, right, or the demand from that foreign market, so here we would have what, 500 minus 0.4 times 150. So I can find the quantity or the number of units that this other country wants, right? So if I do that, we would have 440, right? Now, I think in the quiz and the practice problems, this is kind of what you're asked for. However, I could go one step further, which is instead of asking you for the number of units, right? This is the quantity demanded of the product. So how much they want to buy. What's the total kind of amount or what's the total worth of um, demand for the US dollar? Well, if we want that total amount, it's going to be the number of units that are demanded times, well, how much does each unit cost me, whatever the price in terms of the US dollar is. So here I would take it one step further. Once I find that quantity that they demand, I would then need to multiply that by the initial price levels in the US. Right? So I think if I do that here, I get what? 13,200, if I'm doing my math correct. Let me double check my. Oh, no, what did I do here? So I had price levels in the US for 60. We found 440. So my math is a little off here. This would be what? 26,400. Any questions on that idea before we keep moving here? So we're okay with this one? So in some of the practice problems, it was specifically asking you about the number of units. If I ask you for the demand for the number of US dollars, it's that number of units times whatever the price in terms of the US dollar would be. Okay. All right, so increase, decrease in exchange rate and its effect on QF. So you're wanting what do you mean QF? Kind of the demand for the number of units? Or do you want the demand for the US dollar, kind of that x-axis of our international market for the US dollar? So number two on practice quiz 6. Okay. So practice quiz 6, number two, we would say, so you're wanting, you've got the exchange rate, you want to know the effects on prices and the quantity demanded of foreign products. Yeah, so this is kind of That first part would be thinking simply about the equation. So if I have the price in the foreign market is the price in the US market times that exchange rate, the first part is asking you if the exchange rate decreases, what's happening to the price to Japan for the same good, it would be decreasing. And that's kind of our first part. And then the second part is, well, if we have that same price, that price decrease, what's going to happen to the quantity demanded of US goods? Mhm. So if we think about what's going to happen to the US is quantity demanded of Japanese goods. So this is where we then kind of moved towards thinking about more so that supply and demand for the US dollar, right? And then thinking about here what my exchange rate is. So I likely wouldn't ask you a question quite like this. I said I'm going to focus on kind of just foreign demand for the US dollar, but we can walk through this idea. So if prices um, fall, right? If that's we had the prices in Japan fall, right? Essentially, what that means is our exchange rate would fall, which means that the US dollar is depreciating or has less value. So this is kind of what we introduced the idea of when the US dollar depreciates or exchange rates are lower, are we going to want to import more or less? Well, if our value of our dollar has less value, we're going to import less, right? Which means that the US demand for Japanese products is actually decreasing. Okay. And then if the value of the US dollar is decreasing, these two things always go hand in hand. If the domestic currency is going down in value, whatever that foreign currency is has to be going up in value. Or we would think about the foreign currency is actually appreciating. Okay. So on the exam, I would focus more on not the US's demand for other products in terms of this type of question. Um, but really the concept I wanted to get at here was when the dollar depreciates or exchange rates are lower, that means we have less value. We're going to import less. So that means that demand for foreign products is going to go down from the US. And then connecting the idea that if the US dollar depreciates, the other currency is appreciating in value. Okay. Any other questions here people want to see worked through? Okay. Um, so no other questions. I can kind of pick one here. So let's say I had a question and I'm thinking about, so let's say here, I've got the quantity of US dollars and exchange rates. I'm thinking I've got supply, demand, my initial equilibrium interest rate, and I'm then going to think about what impacts are changes in the exchange rate going to have on our economy, right? So we've got long run aggregate supply. And these types of questions, I'm always going to kind of give you this idea that we start out with no gap in long run and short run GDP, or current and potential GDP are exactly the same. So I might give you something like the following. Let's say that interest rates in the foreign market increase, right? So changes in foreign markets will impact what? Supply of the US dollar. So if interest rates are higher for that foreign currency, if we invest into it, we're getting a higher return. So you can kind of think about this increases the returns of investing into that currency. So are we going to want to buy more or less of that, or are we going to put more of that US dollar out there on the international markets? We would increase it. So what is that going to do to our exchange rates? It's going to lower them. So what did that decrease in exchange rates do? It made the dollar, the US dollar, have less value. So we can't buy as many foreign products. So what's going to happen? Imports are going to go down, which essentially causes net exports to then go up because net exports is exports minus imports. If imports are falling, net exports are going up. And then we said we can always think about there is technically a secondary effect. I shouldn't say secondary, there's a simultaneous effect, but it works in the same direction, which is that if the US dollar is worth less, that foreign currency has an increase in value, which means they can buy more US products, which would also increase net exports. So if that's the case, remember aggregate demand here was C plus I plus G plus net exports. So if those increase, we get an aggregate demand increase here. So what has happened to our short run GDP? It's going to increase. Okay. So what has this caused? Well, if GDP is now too high, what type of gap do we have? Inflationary. So in any problem, if we go back to module 9 or kind of connect module 9 here to module 12, anytime we have an inflationary gap, we always know what the fiscal policy response is. And then I'll go through another example here just to kind of tie this together. Then we also could think about if I have an inflationary gap, what would the monetary policy response be? So if we want to solve this inflationary gap, what do we actually want to do, right, in terms of fiscal policy? Well, we want to decrease GDP, right, so that we get back to having no gap. How do we do that? Well, we can do two things. We can decrease government spending, right, or decrease G, or we can increase taxes. They're kind of the indirect effect was when we increase taxes, we're essentially lowering consumption. All right. So the response to the change in the exchange rate from the government should be, well, if we want to close that gap that that change in the exchange rate caused, we want to either decrease government spending or we want to increase taxes. Okay. Now, as a follow-up, just to kind of maybe adding in some more difficult questions here, although I likely wouldn't combine it with this. But let's say, once again, we have these simultaneous shifts. So if I see that the change in the exchange rate was doing what? It was causing short-run GDP to increase, right? Now, if at the same time we add in that government spending decrease, well, what is that going to do? That's going to lower our short-run GDP. So in order to close that inflationary gap, which of these have to be kind of, well, sorry, let's say it this way. If I don't close the inflationary gap, what had to be true? Well, it would have to be that that decrease caused by government spending was actually smaller than that increase caused by the changes in the exchange rate. So if I were to tell you that the inflationary gap is not closed, you know that that shift caused by government spending must not have been larger than the shift caused by the exchange rate. If it was larger, right? So I drew this out as a relatively small shift. If government spending goes down goes up, down by a ton, well, there we're going to end up with that total effect would be we actually see not only is the inflationary gap closed, we've actually went from an inflation to a recessionary gap. Okay. So we could have these, we worked through one earlier. It was a simultaneous shifts in aggregate demand. And I think it was through what fiscal policy and monetary policy. So there we could kind of do a similar thing. Okay. If they were equal, yeah, we would be back to no gap. That's hopefully what the government does, right? They correctly identify what that inflationary gap is and change government spending or taxes that would have the same impact. So I might give you a question where I connect the international market and the exchange rate to kind of market or aggregate supply, aggregate demand model, thinking about the changes that would occur in our real GDP in the short run, causing inflation or deflationary gaps. Likely these would be like two separate questions. So one, I would ask you like, what does that change in the exchange rate do in terms of causing an inflationary or deflationary gap? And then a second one would be if I see that change caused from the international market, and I also see that there's a government response, then kind of what would have to be true if we, did close or we did not close the inflationary gap, or just specifically like in the question I was originally thinking about, just once we have that inflationary gap, what should the fiscal policy response be? Okay. Now, a separate question could be we could go through the same thing, but instead of thinking about the fiscal policy response, and this is where we could identify maybe an easier question, but then a more difficult one. So let's say we had that same, something that was changing, that was decreasing the exchange rate. Well, if that happened, we said what's going to occur? So we had a decrease in the exchange rate, which we said increases net exports, right? So what did that do? It caused our short run GDP to be greater than our long run GDP, and we said we had this inflationary gap. Okay. So this is where you could draw this out, and I will, but also if you want to just kind of connect the reasoning, you could do it this way as well. So what would the monetary response be? Well, first of all, they want to lower GDP. So they want to use contractionary monetary policy. If we want to lower GDP, so this is where I think working backwards is more helpful when we're connecting a monetary response to an inflation or recessionary gap. So if we had an inflationary gap, or sorry, we wanted to reduce GDP. If we want to do that, how does the monetary policy impact aggregate demand? Well, there, changes in monetary policy change interest rates. So we're thinking it's working through the investments into physical capital. So if we want to decrease the GDP, we want to decrease investments into physical capital. So this is where investments into the US dollar are not the same as investments into physical capital. To make investments into physical capital, we have to take out loans. So there, is that real interest rate a good or a bad thing? Well, if we're taking out loans, lower real interest rates are good, so we would invest more. Here, if I want to lower investment, I need to make taking out those loans more costly to these companies. So increasing the interest rate would lower investment. If I have this increase in my real interest rate, how does the Fed cause that, right? So when we had our money market, right, which was impacting the quantity of money here, we kind of have this relationship between the interest rate. We had our demand for money, and then we said there's going to be some fixed overall supply of money. So this is where it looks a little bit different in the international market because the supply of US dollars in the international market was only a portion of the overall total amount of the US dollar that exists. Right? So here we start out, here was our real interest rate. What do we want to do? We want to increase real interest rates. So how can the Fed do that? Well, I need to get that equilibrium interest rate to be higher. The Fed influences the supply of money. So they're going to want to actually decrease that supply of money to raise real interest rates, to lower investment, to lower GDP, which helps close that inflationary gap. So if you wanted to, you don't have to go through these steps every single time. You could know that anytime I have an inflationary gap, what does the Fed want to do? They want to lower money supply, right? Now, how do they do that? Well, we said they have two tools, right? And I said technically they have four, but I'm only going to focus on two on the exam. So one way I can lower the money supply is to simply take money away from the banks or sell these bonds and securities, right? When I sell them, the bank has to give me money. I'm taking money away from the banks and lowering money supply. What's the other tool we said they had? Well, I can force the banks to set more money aside by increasing that required reserve ratio. So if I asked you here, what is the monetary policy response to an inflationary gap? Well, there they want to lower GDP. They need to lower the money supply. And then how do they do that? Kind of like as a separate question, they can sell bonds and securities, or they can increase the real required reserve ratio. Sorry. Okay. Or they're engaging in what? If we want to lower GDP, we would say they're engaging in contractionary monetary policy. Okay. Any other questions that people want to see worked through or a specific topic? That really hits on a lot of the ones that I have written down. There's one more I could think about that might be good to work through that we haven't, but if anyone has other specific questions, we can kind of go with those. Okay. Um, so we did the money market. I think this one would be valuable. It's kind of going back. I feel, I wanted to cover some more Module 12 stuff. I think we kind of have here. Um, but let's think about a simultaneous shift one. So this might be not combining modules. This is specific to Module 12. So let's say I'm thinking about the quantity of the US dollar here. I'm thinking about my exchange rate, right? So I've got my supply and my demand for the US dollar. And I have that kind of initial exchange rate. And I also could have like the initial equilibrium quantity of the US dollar. Okay. So what if I gave you simultaneous shifts, right? So the first thing I tell you is let's assume that prices in the foreign country go up. Okay. This could be just one question. This might be like one of the easier Module 12 questions. What is that impact going to have on equilibrium exchange rates? Okay. Well, if the price in the foreign markets go up, is the US going to be more or less likely to want to invest in that foreign market or supply more US dollars, right? We have a change in the foreign market. That should be changing supply of the US dollar. Well, if things are more expensive, we actually don't want to hold as much of that foreign currency. So that should cause a supply decrease. Okay. What did that do to the equilibrium quantity? Sorry. And I have to have that on just in case something happens with my son, but that's not the number. So we would see that that increases our equilibrium exchange rate. So exchange rates go up, the quantity of the US dollar goes down. Okay. Now, if we had a simultaneous change in the domestic market, so this is where if I have simultaneous changes when I'm thinking about exchange rates, I would put them on separate graphs because the relative size of these shifts is going to matter. So here, if I started out, here's my initial equilibrium exchange rate, my equilibrium quantity of the US dollar in the international markets. If we then had, what do I want to do here? Let's do let's say that real interest rates for the US actually go down. Okay. So if interest rates are lower in the US, when other countries buy products or invest into that US dollar, the returns are going to be lower. So are they more or less likely to want to hold? Here, I'm writing this out here. Sorry, this is a D. Are they more or less likely to want to hold that US dollar? Well, if the returns are lower, they're less likely. So we would see demand decrease. What impact is that going to have? Well, that's actually going to lower exchange rates and lower the quantity of the US dollar. So if I'm thinking about these simultaneous changes, Here I would have what? The interest rate decrease in the US caused exchange rates to go down, but it caused the quantity of the US dollar to also go down. So if the question that you could see is I could give you two things, right? Something that shifts supply, so a change in the foreign markets, something that changes in the US, which would shift kind of demand, right? What is the total effect going to be on both exchange rates and the quantity of the US dollar that we see? So if I have this total effect here, what's going to happen to exchange rates and that equilibrium quantity of the US dollar? Well, if these happen at the same time, we know that equilibrium quantity of the US dollar has to go down. They're pushing it in the same direction. So maybe a follow-up question is I ask you, in order for that equilibrium quantity to decrease, which of these effects has to be larger? The answer there would be it doesn't matter, right? They're both pushing that equilibrium quantity of the US dollar down, so it doesn't matter what the relative size was. However, what's the change in that equilibrium exchange rate? We don't know, right? They're pushing that exchange rate in opposite directions. Now, that would be one question, maybe I guess I shouldn't say easier, but an easier simultaneous change question. I could then follow this up with what would have to be true if we do see, I didn't leave myself a lot of room here. So maybe like a secondary question would be if we see that exchange rate increase, what has to be true about the change caused by foreign prices relative to that change in US real interest rates? Well, if the exchange rate goes up, whatever causes it to go up, that's the effect that has to dominate. So it would have to be that the change caused by that price increase in the foreign market must be larger than that change caused by falling US real interest rates. So there, the change in the exchange rate depends on the size of these shifts, but the change in the equilibrium quantity of the US dollar does not. Right? It doesn't matter. So let me look in the chat. So in the domestic market, an increase in real interest rate causes demand. No, right? Well, I guess it depends on how you're thinking about the domestic market. So it's two different models, right? When we're thinking about exchange rates and the supply and demand of US dollars, there, higher interest rates, or I guess here I have lower interest rates. When we're thinking about the demand for the US dollar, it's countries making investments. If I'm making investments into the US dollar, it's going to pay me a certain return. So there, lower interest rates are a bad thing, or it would decrease the demand that we see for the US dollar. When we go back to thinking about investments into physical capital, well, how are these companies making these investments? They were taking out loans. So there, they're not getting a return from their investment in terms of um, their decision to make them or not. They're going to have to pay more or less for these loans. There, if the interest rate is lower, that's actually good because when they take these loans out, they're paying less money, which is why that relationship between investments into physical capital and interest rates is the exact opposite of investments into the US dollar and interest rates because here we're thinking about investments. I'm not taking out loans. I'm just taking my current money and putting it into these projects, or I shouldn't say projects, putting it into the US dollar. When it was companies, if we have changes in the interest rate, that's going to change how much money they want to take out in loans. So there it kind of works in the exact opposite direction. I don't know if that was your what kind of the question you were getting at there. Um, because a separate question could be what if we're just looking at the exchange rate market, there the interest rates are always like a good thing. It's just that if we're looking at changes in the US interest rate, then we're thinking about demand from other countries. If I think about changes in, say, the foreign interest rate, well, there that's going to change the supply of the US dollar. So in this case, maybe I don't tell you that there's a change in prices. What would have kind of the same impacts or what would kind of lead to us drawing out the same graph? Well, if the supply, or sorry, if the US dollar, now what did I have here? So let's think about real interest rates in the foreign market instead of changes in price levels. Well, what would cause a supply decrease, or what would make the US want to invest less into these foreign markets currencies? Well, if that interest rate is lower, there's lower returns, we would see fewer US dollars supplied to those foreign markets. Uh, Not necessarily for that second question in terms of I put them on separate graphs. I think when you're looking at earlier modules, it's helpful as well. I think it's definitely helpful here. But let's say I go back to, here's a good one. So let's say we've got our original long run aggregate supply, short run aggregate supply. I'm going to shorthand this for the sake of time. So we've kind of got our long run GDP. Let's say we had I don't know, decrease in taxes, right? This was like our fiscal policy. What does that decrease in taxes do? It increases aggregate demand, which does what? That's going to cause short run prices to increase and cause our real GDP in the short run to also increase. Now, if I gave you kind of a so this is like a decrease in taxes caused this to happen. If we at the same time had a monetary policy response, okay, so let's say I tell you that they're decreasing taxes, but at the same time, we're seeing that the Fed, so we're starting out kind of in this initial kind of equilibrium, we have no gap. If at the same time the Fed chooses to, let's do um, sell securities. Well, if we're selling securities, we're thinking about that money market. We've got kind of our demand for money, our supply of money. If we sell these securities, we're taking money away from the banks. So we're lowering the supply. What are we doing to real interest rates? We're actually increasing them. Increases in the real interest rate. Here, we're thinking about investments into physical capital. So with higher interest rates, we have to pay more for those loans. We would see a decrease in investment. So that's going to shift our aggregate demand to the left or decrease it. What are the impacts of that? Pushes our price levels to be lower, pushes our short run GDP to be lower as well. So here, if I'm thinking about these simultaneous changes in both fiscal and monetary policy, the selling of securities caused my short run prices to fall, and it caused my short run GDP to also fall. Right? So there, what's going to, excuse me, what is the impact going to be? Well, here for both of them, it depends, right? These simultaneous changes in both fiscal and monetary policy, one of them is causing prices and GDP to go up, the other is causing prices and GDP to go down. So in this case, the answer to both of these would be it depends. Now, if I tried to put these on the same graph, well, if I do like a small shift from the fiscal policy, well, there I still have GDP being higher than before. If I have a really large change in that monetary policy, I now have GDP being even lower than it was before. So yes, I would still, if I have simultaneous changes, if it were me, I would always kind of draw them on separate graphs. And then kind of using these arrows, I think it makes it a little bit clearer to see what's going to happen overall. Does that answer the question, hopefully? All right, so we got what, 5 minutes here. Any other like clarifying questions or just kind of I don't have time to work out like a real complicated problem, but any kind of other questions people wanted to see worked through or just had in general. Okay. Okay. So I'm going to think if there's anything that would be helpful for me to kind of go through. Um, One thing that we didn't touch on that I would expect a question on is if I have kind of the secondary effect that we didn't cover today, which is let's say I've got this aggregate demand, I've got long run aggregate supply. We start out with no gap. If we had changes in taxes, right? Or here, I'll do it this way because it's more likely what I would ask you on the exam. So let's say I had increase in government spending, right? So the secondary effect or the crowding out effect is going to be how does that change the quantity of loanable funds and how does that impact real interest rates? So for our loanable funds market, if we think about the interest rate starts here, so let's assume that this increase in government spending, and here I would probably just focus on kind of the secondary effect, but we could kind of combine the two to think about this just to make a point. So if I increase government spending, I'm increasing kind of that real GDP. But if I specifically ask you, okay, what does that increase in government spending do? What does that specifically do to my price levels or to my kind of short run GDP? Now I'm putting these on the same graph, but if I would kind of keep these as separate questions. So let's say I have that change in government spending, and as a result, I end up back at this point where there's no gap. Well, what is that secondary effect of government spending? They have fewer funds to kind of loan out. So that's going to cause us to see a decrease in that supply for loanable funds, which causes interest rates to go up. So if we're thinking about interest rates in our aggregate supply, aggregate demand model, what do higher interest rates do? They make investments into physical capital go down, right? So what would the impacts be if we see instead investments go down? Well, that decreases aggregate demand, right? So if I was starting out this point, aggregate demand decreases, that's going to cause both prices and short run GDP to go down, or we might be more likely now to have this recessionary gap. So there we kind of be, focusing in right there on what is that secondary effect in terms of when government spending goes up, what is the secondary effect on our kind of long run prices, or sorry, our short run prices and short run GDP. Now, if I wanted to, I wanted to make this point. This is something that we went through in class. I wouldn't push you quite this far in the exam. But when we increase government spending, we said this is going to happen. That secondary effect, which we call the crowding out effect, we just said it decreases aggregate demand, right? So it's going to kind of mitigate any of those effects of fiscal policy. It won't make them have as large of an impact, okay? But kind of knowing simply just how a change in government spending would that impact the loanable funds market, and then just specifically how would that change our short run GDP and price levels, that might be a good question to know. Okay. And then if I have an increase in government spending, uh, another way to think about that crowding effect is if I have a decrease in taxes, people don't need to protect themselves in terms of having more money set aside to be able to pay those taxes. So they would be willing to supply fewer funds as well. So, like everything with fiscal policy, if we're increasing government spending to get that same impact, or even here the same crowding out effect, we would see the same thing happen from a decrease in taxes. Okay. Any questions on that? So before we end here, at the end of this video, I want to mention one thing, and I put it in the instructions in the final, but I might be very kind. And I know that, so it's set to you can only work at a question at a time, but you can backtrack. I would make sure that I have enough time to answer question 30 because question 30 is meant to be purely opinion based. So you're starting out, as long as you answer question 30, you will get 1 out of 30. Right? You 1 out of 30 possible points there because any answer is going to be counted as correct. So make sure you're either answering that. I wouldn't answer it first just because you'd have to go through all the way to the very end and then backtrack. But I would make sure you're saving yourself enough time as you get towards the end of that 2 hour time block that you kind of go to question 30 and simply answer it. Okay. All right. So I'm going to end the recording there.